The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
It's 12 o'clock. Welcome and thank you for joining us. Before we start, we want to go over a few housekeeping items. You'll see a website for Mentimeter at the top of each screen. Mentimeter is a polling and survey tool that we're using for today's presentation. So if you go to menti.com and enter that code that you see at the top, 875836, you'll be able to follow from your device and also participate in the icebreaker that we'll have coming up. We are recording this session and it will be available afterwards. Please feel free to use the chat box to say hi or let us know about any technical issues that you're having. And also please feel free to use the questions box if you have questions for our panel. And that is my daughter. Okay, we have a very full hour planned and a very distracted 5-year-old in the house. So we'll get started with the community agreement to set our intentions for our discussion. This is an open space, but we ask that you hold yourself accountable for the impact of your words and your growth. Pauses are opportunities to reflect and to be intentional. We are in the middle of 2 public health crises, systemic racism and the COVID-19 pandemic. Racism and white supremacy are the reality. Black Lives Matter. I'm Sanju Kim. I'm an architectural design and project manager in our Portland office of Gensler, where I lead the higher ed practice area. I'm also co-founder of Diversity in Design, which is a networking platform for design professionals of color. So why are we talking about emotional and psychological safety during Design Week? I think that as designers, we have a responsibility to create experiences and environments that are inclusive and safe for all members of our community. So today, instead of jumping to a design solution, we're going to take a step back, listen, and look at what does safe mean, especially now, so that we can start our design processes from empathy. We are so grateful to our panelists who each have significant and meaningful life and work experiences in emotional and psychological safety. Avi, would you like to start the introductions? And then within your introduction, if you could also kind of answer how do you define psychological and emotional safety and how is that important in your community and your work?
Absolutely. So my name is Avi Diol. My pronouns are she, her, hers. And I'm currently the deputy director at Rosehaven. So we're a day center that serves women, children, and gender diverse folks in various life transitions. So as a licensed social worker, I have worked with marginalized, underserved, and underrepresented populations for nearly 2 decades now. And at our nonprofit, Rosehaven, that's really at the surface every day. So when I think about emotional and psychological safety and how it's important to our work, a couple core themes come to mind as a social worker. And those core themes really are around self-determination, autonomy, choice. I recognize that in some aspects that's not always possible, but underlying those themes, that foundation, are the way we approach our work. So dignity, respect, compassion are really core themes. When I think about emotional and psychological safety and how we try to embody that in the work at Rosehaven, it's really being vulnerable and open to feedback. So not only for those that we serve, but us ourselves, we're also part of that equation. And to be honest, so as I mentioned before, to really strive around self-determination, autonomy, and choice, even when that's not possible, sitting in those hard conversations and truly being able to receive that feedback when you solicit it and when you ask for it. And so there might be times where I have to have a very tough conversation and provide some answers or feedback that person really doesn't want to hear. But if I'm honest and I'm compassionate and I'm genuine through that interaction and engagement, that person will leave that engagement feeling seen, acknowledged, and heard. And they'll know that I'll always be honest with whatever I'm sharing. So those are kind of the underlying tenets that I think about when I approach my work through and thinking about emotional and psychological safety.
Thank you. Thanks for being here. Steph, would you like to go next?
Yeah, thank you. I'm Steph. I use she and her pronouns. I'm the managing director at Tusk Consulting. So Tusk is a social change consulting firm. What we do is we come into organizations to help them move closer to justice through radical transformation. So we're looking at all aspects of organizational life, from your culture and behavioral norms to your systems and your processes and your policies, to your products or your services. So we're helping leaders and teams understand the really specific ways that racism and systemic oppression are showing up in their organizations, and then together imagine what's possible when they center anti-racism in their work and in their organizational life. So our work is in transformation, which means that psychological safety and emotional safety is super important. And when I think about what that means, like similar to Avi, a couple of things come to mind for me. So one, safe space is it's the ability, and it gives us the capacity to enter into what we call brave spaces, right? It means that we've set the container and that folks are consistently setting the container such that dignity and humanity are always centered and respected for the purpose of building the capacity for everybody to engage in sometimes difficult conversations in a place of productive discomfort. So often I think about what it doesn't mean, right? Safe space does not mean comfort. Discomfort is an important and integral part to organizational and systems transformation. And often that term gets co-opted, usually by white folks, to mean like my safety, right? And it's used as a reason to exit conversations or deny conversations that are going to bring forth the safety of everybody involved. So we think about it as anything that's needed so that my needs are met as an individual person with dignity and fullness of humanity, so that I can engage in the fascinating and sometimes hard work of creating radical transformation.
Thank you. Kat?
Hi, I'm Kat Tacker. I'm a psychiatrist at Oregon Health and Science University and down at Oregon State Hospital. And I direct the psychiatric education for the medical students at the university. So emotional and psychological safety are sort of the bread and butter of our field. But I think that it gets very complex very quickly depending on where you're trying to accomplish that. And at the state hospital, I was realizing that ironically, it's usually physical safety that brings people there. And then many of the things that we end up needing to do to help preserve immediate physical safety are often at odds with emotional and psychological safety. And in effect, people feel out of control, both within themselves and then also their fears around the control other people may have over them. And I think that it becomes challenging to try to meet all of those safety goals all at once at the same time. And sometimes you're just trying to figure out how to navigate between them in a way that someone can find meaningful and fulfilling, and ultimately get that person to their goals. And I think that related to environment, I think about the framework that we teach the medical students to use when they're thinking about a patient. We try to ask them to think biologically, psychologically, and socially, how that person's current situation plays out and what factors are affecting them. And especially in the state hospital environment, our team was realizing that a lot of our patients were sort of getting mixed messages from the environment about their safety and their well-being and their autonomy. And so it caused us to think about, well, how do we add that fourth element into looking at that person's life in the moment? The physical, the psychological, the interactive, but then all of those things, there's this thread of the space that they're in and how that affects the person or all the people in that environment. So I think environment is too often a neglected aspect of safety.
Thank you. And Bevan?
Hi, everyone. I'm Bevan. I lead Gensler's non-for-profit practice, and I really focus mostly with mission-based clients. So whether that's kind of a cultural client, museums and libraries, or non-for-profits that connect with the sort of the public realm. And for me, the idea of emotional and psychological safety really is a huge responsibility for architects. Similar to doctors signing a Hippocratic oath when they graduate, honestly, I think architects really sign a social contract to provide environments that create places of belonging, places of welcoming, places that sort of open their doors and make every person who has a whole range of different experiences feel like they're welcome and belong in that space. And so for me, I've spent the last couple of years working with a lot of clients who have really sort of challenged the rules around what it means to create spaces that are equitable and sort of include a whole diverse range of experiences so that everybody can enter through the front door. Everybody has that same entry experience where they walk through that building and they're not sort of waiting for their friend who has issues walking or is bringing their child in or is in a wheelchair, sort of taking a separate entrance. And beyond that, then it's like providing restrooms for people who feel like they have a specific place that they want to go. And it's not just about sort of making those decisions for the people who are using the space. So we're really trying to work as designers to do better, to create spaces that feel a lot more, I would say, you know, not just equitable, but welcoming and open. And so for museums and libraries, those are some challenging aspects. You know, these are supposed to be places of democracy. They're supposed to be places that welcome all types of people. So how can we sort of work then with our clients to improve their programming and then really sort of take it beyond just the design? So that's sort of what I see.
Thank you. And thank you all for being here. If you missed our explanation of how to participate in the icebreaker, if you go to menti.com and then enter that code that you see 875836, you can participate, and you can do that from any device. So we want to take a moment here to ask our guests in the audience, what does emotional security mean to you? We're going to stay on this for a little bit, and you can answer this question multiple times. And if you want to think about it while the panel is going on and kind of revisit and add to your response, please stay on this page and don't click next question, because that will take you to the next slide and you won't be able to go back. So we'll give a couple of minutes here for everyone to access the page and answer, and I will do the same thing. So a lot of comments about judgment and kind of things that are related to, I guess, bravery, the way that Steph you were talking about. Okay. So let's start our panel with the first question. How do we create conditions needed for psychological safety from both a spatial and policy-driven perspective? Avi, do you want to kick off this discussion? Because you kind of shared that your role in your community at Rosehaven are kind of a microcosm of all of these issues.
Yeah, truly, because you know what my fellow panelists have shared with their expertise in their work, Rosehaven kind of is that little ecosystem that operates on all those levels, from the micro to the meso, the macro, understanding the systemic things that are at play externally, even outside of our physical space, and under the pandemic outside of our, you know, in our yard. So we've had to shift vastly. And much like the attendees have already shared of, you know, what it means to them, and kind of really nailed that of judgment free. So when I think about the conditions that are needed for me as a social worker and at a community-based nonprofit, it's really thinking about the community. So for me, the conditions are are we having conversations? Are we making it accessible to the people that we serve? And as much as possible to try and topple that hierarchy. As a deputy director, I have to recognize that I have power and privilege. So even if I'm approaching our community and trying to work on that grassroots level to seek feedback, the way that I'm asking it, where I'm asking it, how I'm asking it, my nonverbals, all of that are very strong variables that I have to be aware of, so we can truly have that interaction and exchange. And for me, it's also just not operating in a vacuum. So thinking about who's at the proverbial table, right? So who have we invited? Who did we neglect to consider? Even if we have everybody at the table that we think should be there, are we ensuring that voices are being elevated and heard? And if they're heard and we're hearing feedback, are actually doing something about it? So when I think about, as a social worker, if I ask a question, I want to really hear the answer. And so we have to remind ourselves that questions can be invasive and powerful. And so that's something that we want to consider. One thing that, another question that was kind of part of this was, what role does shame play in exclusion or perpetuating exclusion? And I think that's a really powerful question that initially I thought, oh, this kind of, it almost felt like out of left field, but the more that I thought about it, it's really at the heart of this conversation. Dr. Brene Brown is a social science researcher. She's a social worker, and she studies shame, vulnerability, courage, bravery. And she identifies that shame really needs three things to exist. It needs secrecy, it needs silence, it needs judgment. And, from the attendees already saying that, to make, create psychological or work towards psychological and emotional safety, we need to get rid of judgment. And in order to really dispel shame, we need to fight it with the antidote of bringing those conversations into the light, into the openness and being vulnerable, and douse it with empathy. So with that, it won't be able to survive. And I do want to share one quote that she shared on that. Brene says, I define shame as the intensely painful feeling of experience of believing that we are flawed and therefore unworthy of love and belonging. Something we've experienced, done, or failed to do makes us unworthy of connection. I think what she's getting at there is the community. Shame is different than guilt. Shame is really internal, that we're carrying in ourselves, and it is highly correlated with trauma, with addiction, with violence. And the folks that are coming to Rosehaven are experiencing those things. So if I think about the physical space and everything that the panelists will have touched on and will dive into, we can do our best to create that, strive for that safe space. But if that person is carrying that shame with them, they still might not feel secure, safe. So one question I think about is, from a guest or a client or a patient, do I see myself represented here? Do I see the folks who are providing services? Do I see myself in them? Do I think that they're considering who I am and my experiences when they're making decisions? From the pictures on the wall to the folks who are providing services to the high levels who are making the decisions. Those are some of the core things that I think about from the micro to the macro level of striving towards psychological and emotional safety, acknowledging that it is different for each person. And that's a beautiful, complex human thing. But there are some things that we can proactively work towards and mitigate to avoid some of those triggers for each of those folks that enter our space to receive services in a compassionate, human, trauma-informed lens. And I do say trauma-informed, recognizing that can be a buzzword, and sometimes we say that without fully understanding what it is and kind of wear it as a badge. When we think about trauma-informed care, we can recognize that most humans understand what trauma is. They can or have had some experience with it. And we want to recognize as practitioners and other humans that we want to understand the signs, the symptoms. We don't want to re-traumatize. But once we recognize those things, what are we doing to adapt and to respond to those through that lens?
Thank you. Kat, do you want to talk a little bit more about the shame aspect that Avi touched on?
Yeah, I think I had kind of a similar revelation as I was pondering it too, to realize how much it really is embedded in what we're talking about. We sort of, I don't know, sort of a euphemism for shame, but in mental health, we often talk about stigma and how pervasive that is throughout our society. And I've had conversations with people who, you know, kind of want to peel back the euphemism layer of that and call it bias or prejudice, and kind of dig down to what it really creates interpersonally between people. And I think that the aspect of shame that people feel when they are feeling incredibly vulnerable, or they are either resisting reaching out for help, or kind of acquiescing to reach out for help, or even enthusiastically reaching out for help. I think that shame is often one of the biggest barriers, and as was already described, that it's often so hidden, and people are not going to necessarily readily bring up what they're feeling shameful about. So we have to find these ways to basically encourage or entice people to feel comfortable enough to do that. How to do that in a physical space, I think a lot of what was just described is beautiful. That, you know, you really want to find the commonalities, find ways to help people feel connected in some way to what's happening in that physical space and who else is in there. And that's really the solution to finding open communication about shame.
And Bevan, you work in architecture and stuff. You work with a lot of organizations. Do either of you have anything that you'd like to add?
I mean, I'll just jump in after, you know, Kat's sort of comment about, you know, how does that manifest itself in the physical way. Well, clearly the building, the end goal is sort of what we get at the end, but it's like the process of how we get to that piece of architecture is also part of this sort of challenge of creating, you know, an engagement process that not only is about the client, the individual client that may be running this facility or sort of leading this facility and the architect, but it's also about the community that uses the space and having input from them along the way about what their needs are, what they're hoping to get out of the space. So that the process starts very, very early on, a lot earlier than we ever get into actually drawing things. So there's this whole sort of strategy around engagement and sort of really trying to design to the edges, where we're really trying to conceive of a whole range of different experiences that will need to be included, and we'll use the space and occupy the space for many more years to come. So once we kind of get through that and really sort of listen and, you know, use empathy as a strong tool to really understand what is required, what the physical space will manifest itself as. And once we get into design, then, you know, lots of light, thinking about tactility of materials, thinking about pattern. All of these things have been proven through a whole range of different studies about lowering blood pressure, bringing down stress, you know, views to green space or bringing green into the space, the sound of water within buildings. These are all tools of sort of connecting you to the outside, giving you this feeling of room and space. And then within that, creating kind of smaller, safer spaces where people can sit and gather and commune and have places to converse and to sort of meet with, you know, other like-minded individuals. So that range of space that sort of gives you that feeling of not being closed in, but then these little kind of pockets of reflection spaces, I think that balance is really important. And I would also say that, you know, really understanding the long-term aspects of how this building will be used. I mean, we often speak with the client and it's like, well, here's what you're going to be doing for the next couple of years, but really, what are you going to be doing for the next 20 years? And you may not know 100% exactly how your organization is going to evolve, but ultimately, when you're building things and that the level of cost and tactility, we need to sort of think through a resiliency lens as well. So there's a lot of different aspects to it, but I definitely think that, you know, thinking about, you know, materials and light and fresh air and connections to the outside are definitely ways that, you know, tools that we can use to sort of help create the right conditions to allow people to feel safe.
Thank you. Steph, did anything resonate there that you'd like to add?
Totally. I love some of the things that y'all are narrating around physical space, and how that how that can imply safety or imply an intended like use case for different spaces. When I look at this question, because my background is in HR, I'm drawn to policy, obviously, right away. And I think they go hand in hand really well, right? What is available to us via physical space is implied behavioral norms and implied kind of community agreements. What policy can do to back that up is make things that are implicit, explicit. So done really well, policy is about how our behavior works together. They're communication tools. They are designed to make things accessible and available to all folks and make really clear both what is expected in this community, in this space, in this organization, and also what are the benefits of it, right? So like any good communication, they do a couple of things. They articulate the purpose or the reason, right? Like here's why the space is the way that it is. Here's why this norm is the way that it is. Here's what the purpose of this policy is. They're sufficiently specific, so they don't rely on this assumption that everyone's working from the same understanding, right? So helping folks understand how do we use this space and how do we interact in this space in a way that I deeply understand what is expected of me and what I can expect of those around me. And they continue to recognize humanity. So they have leeway, they move in the same way that like the kind of diversity of spaces Evan was talking about, like policies need to be similarly flexible, shiftable, right? Responsive to the realities of human life. So all of that was super resonant for me. And I think there's this important role that policy can play in uplifting the inclusiveness of spaces by clarifying like, this is explicitly what the space is for and how we're going to behave together in this space.
Thank you. And that leads really well into our next question. Steph, I'm going to keep you on the spotlight a little bit longer. Because you work with organizations and strategy, if you want to start us off on what should we be talking about to put these things into action?
Yeah. I think, I'm worried I'm going to sound like a broken record, but like my number one thing that we should be talking about is explicitness, like naming the things that are happening in the waters that we swim in. So the more we can normalize talking about white supremacy and the norms and customs of it, the more we can start to understand when I'm behaving in a way or making a choice because I'm steeped in the waters of white supremacy and I assume that it's the default, and what actual other choices are available to me in this moment. So I think this is particularly incumbent upon white folks within organizations and in spaces to understand the different facets of white supremacy and how they are likely showing up both in your life, but also in your organizational practice and culture. The other thing that is popping for me, I think particularly with the audience's reflections and theming around no judgment and like safe space being a place where I can say what's on my mind pretty freely. The other thing we need to be doing or talking about is separating impact from intent. So we want to focus on the impact, right? And like when we talk about safe spaces, it's a multi-directional space. It's both that I can say what's on my mind freely, and in order to do that, I commit to being thoughtful about how that might impact others, how like my feeling of safety and security can either add to or detract from the people who are around me. So starting to separate out those two things and normalizing what it means to be a thoughtful and responsible part of a community, like that's the stuff we need to talk about so that we can create these safer spaces for all folks to thrive.
Thank you. Avi, would you like to jump in on that related to Rosehaven or some of your other past experience?
Absolutely. A lot comes to mind. So I think earlier I alluded to how powerful language can be. And at Rosehaven, you know, certainly as an organization, we have rules we have to follow, but that has such a strong connotation when we say these are the rules here. And it is very top down. So we call them community agreements. It's something that we go over together and that everybody signs, whether you're a volunteer, a guest, a staff member, it's all the same thing. And it's something that we embark in on a journey collectively to uphold these agreements, to try to strive for that safety and feeling like we can all be there and be secure and seen. when I think about the physical spaces, kind of what Bevan had touched on and Steph, I think a lot about universal design, and I'm not an architect, so I don't have the jargon that you do, but a feminist icon, bell hooks, Black icon who really talked about moving the margins to the center. And so if we design, if we think about policy, anything that we do with those folks in mind who have been pushed to the fringes, inevitably all of us will benefit. And so I think one of the easiest or more common examples we hear are those divots in the sidewalks when you are crossing the street. That, typically it's built where there is that ledge and you have to step over it. But if we bevel that out, then everybody can access it. And as somebody who is able to step and walk at this time in my life, I am not affected or oppressed in any way. We simply just opened up access. A couple other things come to mind. We're talking about space. In my previous work as an executive director of a sexual assault response agency to LGBTQIA survivors in the heartland of Iowa, you think about who's designing the space and who are we designing it for. So there was an agency that I worked with that supported sexual assault survivors, but at times when those survivors decided to report to law enforcement, now you're kind of forced into that system because that's how that judicial aspect works. That's another talk. The interview rooms were very cold. It felt like you were in jail. You were clearly in a police building. But through lots of talks with the community who did that work and the law enforcement who also had to be part of it, they were able to recreate a room. And so if you went into that building and you walked by that room, you would feel like you were transporting to another building. Soft lighting, soft furniture, tactile things, fidget toys, the sound of the water, the pictures, and that was the interview room. So we flipped the narrative. Were we designing it for the interviewer or the interviewee? And then finally, honoring our roots, I think, is very strong, and honoring the roots of those who've already done this work and have been saying these things for generations. In my sexual assault prevention and response work, there was some stuff that came out talking about forest bathing, and I hadn't heard that phrase before. This was a couple of years back, where we can really heal through nature and being around trees and the openness. And I thought, wow, what a fascinating thing and a term to put to it. And what that really was appropriating something that had already existed in many communities for generations. So if we're going to do these things and we're going to do our best to be part of this process, we shouldn't assume that we're the first ones to come up with it. And there's no shame in saying this wasn't my idea. I just want to honor who helped promote this. We also recognize just the way that our history and society works. Most people don't get the notoriety that they deserve. So there are a number of unnamed people. So I think honoring our roots, paying attention to our language and our behavior, and thinking about who is the space really being designed for.
Bevan, would you like to add? I know you worked with the Ford Foundation.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so the Ford Foundation is probably one of the largest philanthropic organizations, certainly in the US, if not the world. And they have a headquarters in New York City that was designed in the late 60s, mid to late 60s, also by an Irish architect. So that was a bit terrifying, touching his building. But we did, and we were given this, incredibly interesting brief by our client, Darren Walker, and his team to really think about, what it would take to bring this sort of modernist monolithic building into the 21st century and create a space that was about breaking down the silos of privilege that had existed in the way that the original design had been done into a space that was completely transparent, where you get views straight through the building, removing all the offices. And within this interesting floor plan of this building is this huge, 13-story garden that initially, when it was designed, was kind of one of the first interior gardens within kind of an office building in the US. And the idea was always about kind of that biophilic, connection to workers and what it would feel like to have views of this garden from your very privileged 12 by 12 office that was off this garden. So we moved all these offices, so everybody in the building got access to the garden. We compressed the Ford Foundation team into less floors And then they opened up several of their floors to like-minded foundations and organizations that pay no rent, and that can be part of what is now more of a community and what they're calling the Center for Social Justice. And one of the interesting things that we learned when we started working with this client was really trying to understand, you know, the important aspects of what they wanted to achieve out of this design, and then using those to create a set of guiding principles. So when we sort of talk about putting these things into action as architects, it's like, how do we set up a new process to really ensure that we're, you know, meeting all of these goals? Accessibility, this idea of transparency, that these philanthropic organizations wouldn't be behind closed doors with white men doling out money to, you know, these grantees, that it would be a much more open and kind of public facing organization. They host so many events. If you're a not-for-profit organization within New York City, you can have an event there. You just fill out a form and you turn up and you can use their space. And people in the city really have benefited from having really a beacon for social justice within New York City, but also a building that illustrates very clearly through its design that, you know, it is a place of dignity and that everybody is welcome there. And I think there's something so positive about working with a client who sort of pushes all of your previous ideas about what we need to do to kind of get to a certain point and reach far above and beyond any of the basic, like, accessibility guidelines that are available. Like, how can we think beyond that? So everything we did, every decision we made was to push the boundaries and to think about being, you know, a world-class organization and building that could influence how other people think about running their organizations as well. So it was a very powerful sort of set of lessons for us. And then I think also this idea of opening the building up, they created a gallery space because they really wanted to think about how art has the power to change lives and to engage in kind of complex conversations that sometimes people don't feel safe having those conversations. So they have a lot of artists gather and talk to people who visit the space and, you know, really push issues of domestic violence, issues of femicide really forward to the front of their work, so that when you enter that building, you know you're going to be engaged in a progressive conversation that is going to push the boundaries of what you necessarily feel safe talking about. And there's not a lot of spaces that you can do that. And to me, it is sort of a safe space to sort of allow you to have those conversations.
Thank you for sharing that. Kat, from your perspective, especially for mental health policy and initiatives, are there any ideas that you've been thinking about that we could take action on?
I think that a lot of the policies that we have, especially where I am in Oregon, it becomes such a challenge, going back to one of the first things I mentioned about trying to balance safety in multiple ways. And often policies are sort of covering the institutions more than the individuals, I think. So policies that always err on the side of safety versus dignity and choice of the people within the institution or what the facility, whatever it is, whatever the space is. So I think looking at policies and trying to use kind of a filter on them that, you know, there are these half a dozen principles of trauma-informed approach. A lot of times we think about trauma-informed patient care when we're thinking of a trauma-informed approach in my area. But any policy, you know, really looking at the element of, are you truly giving a choice, or is it kind of a false choice? Are you being fully transparent? Just some of these real fundamental elements that help people not to be re-traumatized by a policy that may be implemented in an institution that is supposed to be helping and lifting people up. So I think from a policy standpoint, just really being methodical and thoughtful about applying those trauma-informed principles. But I was also thinking some about the physical space, and to use the state hospital as an example, our team was trying to figure out how do we make this feel like a more trauma-informed environment. And we were kind of surprised we were in that situation because it was a new facility. It had been constructed in 2010, so it wasn't like it was built decades ago in a different era with different people in power. And yet we were still struggling to help our patients feel that sense of being included and honored and respected and given autonomy. And so there were three things that we kind of came up with as fundamental basics that we were going to try to utilize on our unit to make it a better space. And one was just getting down to the very fundamentals. For the most vulnerable people that were using that space, thinking about the five senses. And in any area of the unit, you know, what are they seeing, hearing, touching? You know, in the dining room, what are they tasting? What are they smelling? And trying to identify from what's already in that space, what of those sensory experiences are therapeutic and what are actually pathologic and maybe even contributing to their distress or their disorientation. And so, you know, not trying to necessarily neutralize the space, but really diminish those fundamental sensory experiences that may be distressing and increasing people's stress level, which then could lead to aggression even, and finding ways to really enhance meaningful therapeutic sensory experiences, and just getting down to the real nuts and bolts of what am I seeing, what am I hearing. The other thing was, the second of the three items that we were focusing on was trying to give people choice. And especially when people are in an environment where they're feeling out of control or that they don't have a choice, having in our unit a way to ensure that people readily had private space and readily had interactive spaces, and that they could fluctuate between that based on their needs in the moment. And that ultimately helped ensure that people had what they needed for the third item, which was trying to make sure people felt like they could connect with others in the space. And the most stark example of that was that the unit was designed, you know, there was sort of the patient areas, the activity rooms and the bedrooms and kind of the central hub of the milieu. And there was what we call the bubble, which was the nursing station, which was just all glassed in and kind of looked out on everything. And we realized that it's literally, it was an architectural definition of us versus them. And so from a policy sort of practice standpoint, we really shifted things to try and encourage staff, whoever they were, nurses or anyone, to not be spending time in that bubble unless they really had to, and instead be out in the patient environment. And that, in essence, it became everyone's environment. And in that central hub, which was just kind of this, you know, arbitrary space with nothing in it, people just passed through it to get to the hallway or the room they wanted. They ended up getting some soft, comfortable chairs and setting them up and bolting them to the floor in kind of a way that would encourage conversation, but yet give everyone enough space. And that in itself really encouraged the staff to come out of that nursing station and sit there and converse with patients versus just being, you know, in a role where they're taking someone medications and then walking away right when the person is done taking the medications. So I think that, you know, thinking about what do the most vulnerable people in that environment need, that if you approach it from that as the foundation, that's only going to help everyone in the environment. And you can kind of take it from a physical space standpoint, but also from a practice and policy standpoint.
Thank you. I'm going to veer a little bit away from our questions, and Avi, some of the things that Kat just talked about in their space seems like it's really relevant to the Rosehaven space. Is there anything that you wanted to comment on, or that you could comment on?
Sure. Yeah, we're continually trying to assess what our space is like, and so I think that's another thing when we think about what we should be talking about and putting into action, is that the conversation is never really over, and so it's something that we should continually revisit. And safety means a lot of different things. Some of it under my job is risk mitigation, physical safety for the dozens of people that are operating in a very small space. So we did get to the point a couple of years ago where we had to change the way our entrance looked. We had to move from an open door with an open corridor where people could just come and enter, to having more of a secure, we could monitor who was coming and going, because we were running into some unsafe issues with people. But I was very mindful that instituting a locked door within that glass really creates a different kind of feel. Even if once you get inside, we're still operating in that trauma-informed way and human and compassion. So what we did was we had a lot of conversations. We let our guests know this is going to happen. We didn't want it to be a surprise. We asked what they thought about it, and there were mixed feelings. Some people were really excited and said, yeah, that would make me actually feel more safe and secure. And then others said, this would feel like a jail, and you're only doing it for yourselves. And so this might create more of an us versus them, and it's really for you and not us. So we were also mindful of how can this has to happen, but how can we make it a space that still feels like what we're striving to do? So we put some paint on there, make sure it was a color that was light, bright, vibrant, inviting. We had our logo, of course, Rosehaven right when you enter, but that corridor that before was just a white long hallway with no windows and nothing. We did have that window. We had to pop out a hole in the wall and put that kind of plexiglass window, but that's where you could first be greeted by, we hired a new position. So our guest services coordinator is now there. You don't have to walk all the way to the end of the building to meet a staff person, especially if it's your first time. You might not know where to go. So you're greeted with warmth, openness, a smile. This person remembers everybody's name. It's an amazing gift that she has. But on the opposite side of that corridor is just art plastered with portraits of our guests, our volunteers, and our staff. And it's made in a way that we can add to it and we can take away from it if people choose that they no longer want to be on that wall. But it was a way that they could come in and say, wow, this feels like home. It doesn't feel like an agency. And so I had conversations with our guests after everything was done, and everyone that I spoke to said, this does feel better. And we can still have that openness and that warmth when we're engaging with those that we serve. Another thing that came to mind, we think about what should we be talking about to put these in action. For me, it's two things that my fellow panelists have already touched on, and it's looking at ourselves. So if we're designing for the human quotient, we're having humans design for humans. So we need to be aware of our implicit and explicit bias, and that it's very rich in this dominance, supreme white supremacy environment, society that we have existed in for hundreds and hundreds of years. So I might want to make sure that I am doing something that's going to be accessible and equitable to all, but if I have my bias, then that decision is going to be tainted in that way. So I have to do some real internal work, and it's a lifelong journey, which means I need to also be vulnerable and open to that feedback when I might misstep, and rely on my colleagues to help guide me. And then finally, all the stuff that we're talking about doesn't fit well in a capitalist society that's driven by money and wants to happen fast. This takes time, so we got to slow down. And some might say, well, you're not being efficient. Where's the hard line? Where's the tangible outcome? And so we need to redefine what success looks like, what the process looks like, and afford ourselves the time to truly have these conversations and to think about it. So those are some of the things kind of the forefront of my mind. Oh, also you mentioned tactile. So we brought in artwork too. Now there was one thing where we had a security assessment come in. So this guy is looking, you know, active shooter, earthquake, fire, and he said, you got to take all these pictures off the wall. These are weapons. People can take them down. And then, so yes, from my other work, I recognize that I could look at something and see it as a potential weapon. And I have to check myself with my perception on spaces and things based on my experience. But I didn't want to get rid of the pictures, and I didn't necessarily want to bolt them to the wall because that also sends a message. So we changed the artwork that we had. Any pictures that we have are guest portraits, and they get to choose. So it's the space is for them, by them. And then the other ones that we have are large, and they nearly cover the wall. So they're bright, they're vibrant, and they're made of felt. They're interactive. They're meant for you to go touch and be tactile. And for some of our guests, you know, on that spectrum of mental health, that's exactly what they're looking for. That's exactly what helps calm them. I recognize that that can, you know, not be calming to everybody. So we try to have diverse things. But switching the narrative, you know, when you exist in a business, things are very confining. They're a little cold, and you know, the idea of having artwork on the wall that you interact with and touch is not something we typically think about in a business or an agency. So yeah, I think just flipping the narrative on how we operate and what we consider is the right thing to do or successful is critical to the conversation.
You said three things that really struck me, Avi. The first one was the fact that, you know, you had a series of conversations with your colleagues and with people at your center that talked about what it was that you needed. So there was a transparency about the fact that you were changing the space. So people were engaged in that conversation, which I think is a really powerful step. The second one was the fact that you put a person at your entry, and having a human as you enter any space, whether it's a library, whether it's a museum, whether it's a non-for-profit, and seeing a person rather than a screen or a sign is like your one way of knowing that you are kind of within a space that respects the human experience and that is about humans speaking to humans. And that is it may seem so simple and so straightforward, but many institutions have been pulling away from that over the last 10 years and putting in digital screens to sort of tell you what's going on. And we're finding people are going back in the other direction because it's just doesn't have that sort of feeling of welcoming. And then the last thing that I loved about what you just said is this idea of, you know, what does it mean to really think about your role in this process and bringing your bias to it. And I certainly know for our profession in architecture, it's a pretty wide profession. We're working incredibly hard right now as a whole profession, and I certainly know my firm is really looking at how we can sort of diversify our colleagues and make sure that when we come to a project that we're not just bringing one experience, that we're bringing a whole range of voices that can sort of bring different aspects to the conversation. So to me, everything you said, these are things that translate so well across, I think, probably everything that we're doing, all of us here, that it's just so important to sort of see those common themes and ways that all of us can sort of help each other to do better, regardless of what it is that we're sort of working on. So thank you for that.
Yes, thank you. I got a little lost in the conversation and lost track of time. Sorry, Natasha. But you've all been gracious with your experience and knowledge, so we want to pick your brains in a different way and give you an opportunity to ask someone else on the panel or a few people on the panel something that you'd like to know from them, from their experience. Steph, would you like to begin?
I'm a processor, so I'm taking in some of that last conversation. I would love to not start if that's possible.
Yeah, of course. I appreciate that. Does anyone else have something that's pressing on their mind that, you know, someone else's comment brought up for them?
I mean, I would love to just ask the question for all of you that work in spaces that have high demands for a set of varied reasons. How can we do better as architects and designers for you? What is it that we can do in terms of our early engagement and really being sort of more sensitive to the needs of how these institutions will function and what they're going to need day to day? I think it would be really helpful for us so we can be better.
I have some thoughts on that. At OHSU, I had sat in and observed some of the new projects, building projects that were going on, and seeing this really amazing process where, like you were describing before, long before the design is drawn up, you're really digging into what people need to do and the practicalities of it and how they want the space to flow and their work to flow. And in that process and in a couple other similar situations, I've seen a lot of sort of the managers and administrators get involved in those conversations. But it's almost a luxury if people who don't often have a lot of power or choice or a very loud voice in whatever that organization or space is going to be, are really heavily involved in that initial conversation where all of these ideas are gaining ground. So I think, like in my field, trying to have the patients and the facilities staff and the nursing assistants and people who are just run ragged with their work all day long and don't always have the position to be able to affect change very easily down the road, that getting their voices heard from that initial step of design.
That's great.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
I think one of the things that I'm hoping for from spaces is that they're like movable and iterable, right? That we're not letting perfect be the enemy of the good, partially because the work that we're doing is experimental and shifting all of the time. We're learning new things about the human psyche. We're learning new things about how systems operate. We're learning new things about all kinds of pieces of psychology that mean that like the pace of change in my environment, I want it to be able to match the pace of change of like this, of like my learning and my experiences. And so sometimes like when I've noticed kind of space build outs in the past, it's been a lot of deep discovery, which is great. And then this kind of tweaking and perfecting until it's like, this is it, this is the finished product. And I don't know what it looks like, but I would love for spaces to feel like the story is still being written so that it can grow and change along with us.
Yeah, I love what Kat and Steph just said. I would absolutely echo that. And I think, Bevan, to your point, what all of us have alluded to is to have conversations before the process actually starts, and to really lean into that and be creative. So part of that is, we might have a suggestion that might go maybe kind of against an architectural rule. So can we lean into that dialogue and see where we can both meet our needs, and getting away from striving for perfection, because I don't think we'll ever get there. And then as soon as we do, it'll be outdated. And for me, it's also not being confined by the systems that are already in place. At the University of Iowa, one of the projects I worked on was surveying all the restrooms on our campus, because we said that we were a very open and welcoming environment to gender inclusiveness, and that we had gender inclusive restrooms or gender neutral ones. And I thought, well, if we have those, where are they? And so I surveyed every bathroom on that Big Ten campus and thought, well, I'm doing this, I might as well look at sharps containers and lactation spaces and locks and accessibility and anything I could possibly think of. And I found myself reading the Iowa Plumbing Code, talking to facilities managers and building designers, and they're thinking, the social work student, I hope she graduates soon, because this is a big project. And reading the plumbing code, I know that there have to be certain toilet fixtures based on a binary gender system, and then they're telling me, well, we can't do any gender neutral bathrooms until we reach this binary quota. And I'm thinking, why? Just because this plumbing code says it, we're just talking about toilets. So why can't they just all be gender neutral or have accessible spaces that are gender designated? So I found myself up against a lot of barriers from the plumbers and from the facilities. And then also I have to acknowledge that I was within the institution of a big nonprofit university. And so I was raising a lot of questions that had challenging answers, and it took a long time. Ultimately, all I wanted to do was create an interactive map that told me what bathroom I could use based on what I wanted. finally it did come through, but not till 4 years after I graduated. So, you know, looking at those structures and say, well, just because it's always been this way, or this is what the policy says, policies are meant to change, and just because it's been that way doesn't mean status quo is the way it should be. So those are a couple of things that come to my mind as well.
Yeah, that's really popping for me, and I know we're close to time, but like for those of you who are experts in policy, like my request is that you shift your frame, right? That you're not like, it's not using those things to be roadblocks or to like build up fences. Like your job is to help those of us who are users of your products navigate that minefield and strategize with like, I know where all the fences are, so I also know how to navigate you around the loopholes in those fences so that you can get the product in the space that is going to be useful and helpful for you, right? Like that's where that expertise can be so helpful.
Thank you. I'm really sorry that we're at the end of our time. Before we finish, we wanted to revisit that icebreaker question in the beginning and give maybe 30 seconds to review and think about whether our ideas of emotional security have shifted during this conversation. And thank you to everyone who has felt comfortable enough to share such thoughtful responses. So it is the end of our time. I want to thank our panelists, Bevan, Avi, Steph, and Kat, and also to our Gensler Portland team behind the scenes, Natasha, Rima, and Mara, and to all of you who are able to join us today for this really, really important dialogue. We ran out of time for audience questions. I'm sorry for that too, but we'll, if our panelists don't mind, we'll send the questions to them and see if they might want to respond to some of them through email. And
yeah,
thank you so much. And I just want you all to know that they've given so much of their time before this already. So we'll share those responses in a follow-up package along with a list of resources and some articles. And we'll do that next week. We'll also be sharing the recording of this panel next week also. So thank you. Be safe and have a good day. Bye.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.